Hey folks, in this episode of This Week in Photo, I have the honor of sitting down with Mr. Joe Edelman to talk Olympus. This is TWIP. Hey, welcome back to TWIP, another fantastic show for you guys today. You may or may not realize that on This Week in Photo, we talk a lot about gear, right? We talk about Nikon, Canon, Panasonic, Fuji, et cetera, but one company has been, for whatever reasons, has been sort of not mentioned that much on This Week in Photo. I want to correct that right now, and to do that, I've brought on Mr. Joe Edelman. Joe Edelman is a fantastic photographer who happens to shoot with Olympus, and we're going to talk about his journey in photography as well as, you know, some of the insider tips about Olympus gear, what the product lineup looks like, et cetera, et cetera. So Joe Edelman, welcome to This Week in Photo, man.
Frederick, thanks for having me. It is great to finally meet you.
It is great to meet you too. Like I was telling
Indeed.
you before we started recording, you and I are both hot off of Photo Plus Expo in New York City. And, you know, I'm walking around the show. This is like one of the first shows I went to as an attendee and not presenting or anything. So I'm walking around with my backpack on, you know, like a regular attendee. And I'm like, what's all that commotion in the Olympus booth? So I go over there. There's a huge, massive crowd, you know, and there's you on stage doing your thing. And I watched you and I'm like, this guy knows what he's doing. You know, you were enthusiastic, affable, you know, self-deprecating, the whole 9 yards, and it was fantastic. So thank you for the presentation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Had a lot of fun. I really did. Got to meet a lot of good people. Had a lot of fun with the stage presentation and just kind of hanging out in the booth. I mean, trade shows are great. They're community, so it's wonderful.
Yeah. So let's start. What I like to do on This Week in Photo when I have someone on for the first time, and welcome, is I like to get to know them a little bit. So to that end, tell us a little bit about Joe Edelman and sort of your journey. I call it the hero's journey, you know, or the origin story, you know, before you became the superhero that you are. Tell us a little bit of your origin story.
So let's work backwards. So today I'm an Olympus Visionary. So I am sponsored by Olympus. That's why I was speaking at their booth. I am also a photo educator. I have a YouTube channel where I really focus on the hows and the whys behind making great photographs. Obviously on YouTube, we've got a lot of really good gear channels. We've got a lot of really, really amazing photographers that I'm hoping when I grow up, I can be as good as them. And then there's guys like me that have been at it for long enough to make me old. So I've learned a couple of things along the way. So that's really what I try to focus on, is kind of how I can help people avoid some of the pitfalls, kind of keep the focus on what I believe should be the real priorities in making pictures, and that's the photograph and what's in front of the camera. So I've been doing that actually full time for the last 2.5 years now. Yeah. I still keep a few of my commercial clients, but you know, I got to the point where I wanted to slow down a little. That didn't work out really well because I'm running crazier now than I've ever, you know, been doing. But I'm meeting a lot of people. I'm impacting people. So it's a ton of fun. My career and how it, you know, got rolling. I started out as a newspaper photographer. Got my first camera when I was 11 because my parents told me no. And I wouldn't accept no. So finally, my father said, hey, you've got money in the bank. You're saving to get a little mini bike. So, you know, make a choice. So just out of spite, I went and got the camera, and I was hooked. I had my first picture published when I was 14, and I was determined at that point that I was going to win a Pulitzer Prize. I was going to be the world's greatest newspaper photographer, but I was obsessed. And so that took me through high school, and I got really lucky. Right out of high school, I was planning to go to the University of Missouri, which back in the late 1970s, you either went to Kent State or you went to Missouri if you were going to do photojournalism. And the day after I graduated high school, I was offered a job as a chief photographer of a small town newspaper. So it's like, yeah, 4 years, do this, and I went with it. And so did newspaper work for a bunch of years, got married, wanted to settle down a little bit, and then on a whim, which was not something I would encourage anybody to do, I decided, hey, no more newspaper work. I'm going to open a studio. Problem was I'd never done studio work. and I knew nothing about running a business. And I had a wife and I had a kid. So the good part is I'm not afraid to hustle. So I shot everything. I shot portraits, weddings. I did swim teams, little league teams. I did events. I was doing product stuff. And then I stumbled into the world of fashion just by chance. And the problem was I wasn't really good at high fashion because I like eyes. And in the fashion world, they don't want the girl's beauty competing with that outfit. So, kind of stuck on the commercial path for a lot of years. And then kept going back to this fashion and this modeling stuff. Did a lot of work in the modeling industry, working with new talent, developing portfolios, and actually kind of mentoring people in how to get started in the business. And that led me to the educational stuff. So the short version of that long story, Frederick, is I don't actually know what I'm going to do when I grow up. It's going to have a camera, though. That's the plan.
Right? That's the whole thing. And I've learned that in my short time on this dirt ball that's circling the sun, right? Is that it's not, it sounds cliche, but it's not a destination. It's the journey.
Sure.
Right? And
absolutely.
And the whole lifelong learner thing is real, especially these days with the how fast things change and how fast technologies change.
Oh my goodness, yes.
You're in something artistic like what we're doing. The techniques change. Like I'm sure you remember a couple decades ago, the wedding photography with the parents in the clouds looking down over the bridge.
Of course,
that was vogue.
I try not to admit that very often, but yes, I do. I do remember that.
You're a defender, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was vogue, and HDR came and went, and selective color came and went, and now we're seeing things. And this is why I want to transition into sort of the Olympus stuff and bite into that. There was this big transition from. We're kind of in the middle of it, I would imagine, from DSLRs. Well, there was film to DSLRs or film to digital, and now from DSLRs into mirrorless. And companies that have sort of pioneered that have been the Micro Four Thirds companies like Olympus and Panasonic, et cetera. Right? So
absolutely.
So tell me about your transition first, because obviously you were shooting film, then you went to digital, but skip forward to the digital and why you made the choice to jump into Olympus.
Sure. Well, for me, making the switch into digital was kind of a no-brainer. I just loved the concept of the technology and all of the creative possibilities that it opened up. So that was an easy switch. I actually first tried a mirrorless camera. It was Sony. It was the A7R, I believe. It was back when they had like 4 lenses.
Yeah, I remember.
So was very happy with the quality of the camera. I'm not afraid to say that. I think Sony, even today, obviously, is doing a lot of great things. The numbers speak for themselves, right?
Right.
But at the time, I was not a big fan of the ergonomics of those cameras, and I'll come back to why that's so important to me. And then the other issue for me was, and it's my own quirk, I don't like adapters. I was a photographer back in the day, sadly, right when zoom lenses were first coming out. And even, the first off-brand lenses, like the early Sigmas and Tamarons, they just weren't good.
Yeah.
So the idea of adapting a lens to a camera was not my thing. So I was not willing to go and buy, a bunch of Canon glass and put it on Sony. And by the way, I had been a Nikon user for actually 42 years. I used Nikon. But I wanted mirrorless. I loved the EVF, having that immediate feedback and response. Just all of it was totally, I see it as the future. I see no reason to have a mirror at this point, period. But Sony wasn't ready for me then. So I kind of reluctantly went back to Nikon because it was comfortable, it was convenient, it's what I always used, and still really was looking. And by a couple of just odd little things that happened, one being I was using Panasonic for my videos on YouTube. And literally the day that I received my GH5 amidst all the hoopla, it was one of those unusual days where I just did not feel like working. So the camera came and I stuck a disc in it. I said, you know what? Everybody says these cameras are okay for stills, but I had that mentality. It's Micro Four Thirds. Why would I do that? I put a disc in and I went out to a park for the afternoon and just shot some random pictures and was really very impressed by what I came back with. So then I started doing some research. And the general thinking at the time that when you would go online and you would read Panasonic, video, Olympus, stills, and everything was like solidly divided, right down the line there. So I went back and forth for a while. Finally, I decided, you know what, I can rent one for like about $150 for a weekend. So I rented an Olympus, an EM1 Mark II, had it for a weekend, had a lot of fun with it, loved it. Now, a little piece of advice for your listeners. I did a really dumb thing when I rented it. I had no plan. So I had fun with it for the weekend, but then when I sent it back, I started coming up with all these things like, oh, wait, I didn't see if it does this, does it do that?
Oh, yeah.
And I had no idea. So I really wasn't any more informed than I had been in the first place. So I rented it a second time. This time I had a checklist, went through it thoroughly, made sure that it was, if I were to make a switch like this, is this camera going to allow me to do everything that I do? I was fine with the idea of, learning new menus, learning new labels and names, etc. But I needed to make sure that I wasn't losing capabilities in the process.
Mm-hmm.
It checked off every one of the possibilities that I needed. And what impresses me still to this day, because I just don't have enough hours in a week, the EM1 Mark II has so many features in it. And this is one of the things I think it's lost in so many of the gear conversations.
Yes.
People want to compare sensor size. And I won't enter that debate. I'm just not. At the end of the day, there are photographers doing great work with small sensors. There are photographers doing great work with big sensors. But I think one of the things that gets lost in the conversation is features. The EM1 Mark II, it simply has an insane amount of features.
Mm-hmm.
And, with Olympus's, program of essentially kind of upgrading firmware a year or so after the camera comes out and giving you new features, like, that's amazing to me. Like Nikon never did that, So
what are some of those features that other camera manufacturers don't have? I'll tell you one that I was excited about because I actually jumped into the world of mirrorless photography into Olympus. It was the OMD Mark II, I think. I forget which one it was.
Okay.
Yeah, and I remember the feature that blew me out of the water because this was my transition from DSLR Nikon into mirrorless, and it was the being able to do a long exposure and see the water draw itself on the screen. So like live exposure.
Well,
that blew me away.
Right. The live time is incredible, especially for nature. Even people that do like star trails, that kind of stuff, or like the cityscapes with the car trails. That's amazing. The other one that I've actually found use for in the portrait world, because I'm primarily a portrait guy, so to speak. In fact, I did this on stage in New York for Olympus, is using the live composite feature. So this live composite feature, it's hard to describe it and do it, but basically what you are able to do is set the camera up to do exposures anywhere from a half a second up until, I believe it's 30 seconds, and I may have that number wrong, but it will just keep repeating that sequence. And you can do this for several hours if you want, but here's the cool part. Once it makes the initial exposure, so when I do my portrait backgrounds, where I'm actually creating a background for the portrait in real time while I'm shooting, and I don't have to do this in the dark. In New York, I did it with the lights on in the Javits Center.
Mm-hmm.
When you first fire the shutter, if you're using flashes, they're going to go off. It's going to record the light on your subject. But then you can take other light, and if you want to draw or paint, you can do that. And the camera keeps, in my case, I use half a second exposures. The camera keeps adding the half second exposures, but it only adds new light to the scene. So once that flash goes off and it records my subject's face, it's there. The only way that I would have any change in the subject's face is if I ran a light in front of it over top. But other than that, I can walk around. So, when I did the demo in New York, I was able to take my time, press the shutter button, casually walk behind the subject, pick up an LED light wand, and then draw the background, walk back, stop the sequence, and you can actually indeed see the image draw on the screen. So once I have my background in, I would add some rim lighting because I was using like blue and red. Mm-hmm. So I would just bring the wand close to the subject's face and add the light. So it's all additive, which is really cool.
That's fantastic.
So, that's kind of one of my favorite play features. On a more practical side, the features that I'm actually most drawn to that the camera has, number one, just because of its size. I mean, Olympus, for me, one of the things that it represents, first and foremost, mobility. Mm-hmm. I had gotten to the point, part of what kept pushing me away from Nikon, why I experimented with Sony, why I eventually wound up looking at Olympus, a lot of money invested in Nikon gear over the years, except I use this to take pictures, my phone. Yeah. That's what I shot with, unless I was getting paid. So the mobility aspect, the size and the weight is huge, but also the ergonomics on that camera are outstanding, especially the EM1 Mark II, which is absolutely my favorite. The ergonomics are outstanding. They fit my hands really well. The controls are just kind of where they should be. But the ability to customize the controls on the camera, and then you've also got 3 custom settings on the top where you've got your dial for like program, shutter priority, aperture priority. Mm-hmm. So like here in the studio, I have 3 settings programmed in. One is if I'm shooting with strobes in color. Mm-hmm. The other is if I'm shooting in black and white with strobes, because since I'm an old school guy with film, I believe in the idea that you light and expose one way for color and you light and expose another way for black and white. So I have my presets in, and then I have one for shooting with continuous light. So instead of having to go into my menus when I want to switch from color to black and white or switch over to continuous lighting, it's literally just C1, C2, or C3, and I'm at my base settings, and all I have to do is adjust my exposure. Yeah. So features like that for me are time savers, are huge in terms of making that camera fit my workflow and fit my needs.
Well, how do you feel about the push into full frame, right? So Sony, it's a hot topic. It's a hot potato.
Sure, of course
and
it
Sony,
is. Yep.
Sony threw the gauntlet down with, like you say, the A7 and it's full frame. Yep. And that was the argument that we hear from DSLR shooters. It's like, I don't want to go to a smaller sensor because, start listing off the reasons why, depth of field, low light performance, etc. Tell me what's your perspective on that as a portrait shooter? Primarily, the smaller sensor size versus full frame argument.
Right. So there's a lot of layers to that, Frederick. And I have to choose my words carefully because I sometimes get myself in trouble here. Okay. But I will relate it. I will relate it one way. Just about a year ago, when I was doing my live streams on YouTube, people were asking me, the same kind of question. And I was getting a lot of gear focused questions. And I started using a term. And at the time, I actually kind of meant the term as a bit of an insult. It was to try and kind of kick people to pay attention. But I realized, though, that it was kind of unfair. So the term was, I started calling people geartographers because they were much more focused and worried about their gear than they were about actually creating good pictures. But now, here's the thing that I learned after I did that, which I do feel bad about. I had someone reach out to me, and they said, I totally understand your point, and it makes complete sense, and it's great at getting people's attention. But I, for one, and this person explained that their enjoyment is actually the toys.
Yes.
This guy was really into the gear. By trade, his day job, he's an engineer, right? Mm-hmm. So it fits. And I realized, okay, so maybe I need to be a little bit more careful there. So where I think this gear situation, unfortunately, kind of goes awry is once you get into gear and you start talking about sensor sizes and optics and everything else, you're bringing the word physics into play. Mm-hmm. Now, which means lots of confusion, right? Lots of different ways to look at it, lots of different debates. And when you look at the cost of these cameras, even the Olympus cameras, I don't care which brand, when you look at the cost, people have a substantial investment in their gear. So who doesn't want to feel that their gear is the best?
Yeah.
So, one of the things that I frequently said at Photo Plus when people would come up and talk to me is like, look around the hall. It essentially was impossible to buy a bad camera at Photo Plus. There were no bad cameras at Photo Plus. Yep. I don't care what brand we're talking about, right? So at the end of the day, it's what are you going to do as a photographer with that camera? Mm-hmm. And I will say, I think that unfortunately that piece of it is really getting lost in so many of the conversations today. We're not focusing on learning to take good pictures. We are focusing on, do I have the best gear? So if you do it straight by the numbers, well, okay, a full frame sensor is bigger, more megapixels is bigger, more dynamic range. But I would argue we're reaching a point with megapixels and even dynamic range that we have technology built into some of those cameras that our eyes and our brains can't actually appreciate it. My wife is a cognitive psychologist, so she studies and researches how do we actually process information with our brains. And indeed, there's research available in the science world that shows that so much of this technology, yes, mathematically we can state this is biggest, this is better, it has more, but in terms of what we are actually able to perceive, You
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah, I love that
So,
term, by the way. I wrote a note down, geartographer.
yeah, you are welcome to use it. Absolutely.
Geartographer. You know what my term is?
Yeah.
Photographer Stockholm syndrome. so,
Well, yes. There you go.
so we
Right.
can put them
I agree.
together. We could say this is a geartographer that's suffering
Sure.
from Stockholm syndrome. You know,
Sure.
and the idea behind that is, you know, you invest thousands and thousands of dollars into your camera system and lenses and all that. Of course, you're going to defend your purchase because you want to be right? So, yeah, I know I 100% agree with you, and that really strikes a chord. And we've been talking a lot on This Week in Photo about moving away from all the gear talk and living between the pixels and into more of the art and science of photography and storytelling, right?
Yes.
So
indeed.
So let's walk down that road a little bit.
Okay.
So in terms of storytelling with your work, you know, in portraiture or whatever. So what advice would you give to photographers that are watching this that may be suffering from geartography and Stockholm syndrome, and they're trying to move away from that addiction and more into the back into the traditional photography? How do you do that? How do you get back into storytelling?
Well, I think first and foremost you actually have to take pictures, right?
Yeah.
You know, I have a YouTube channel. I love when people watch my YouTube videos, but I finish every one of my live streams, which are usually 90 minutes, and I remind people, hey, if you were here for 90 minutes, you have to promise me before you come back and watch another one of my videos, spend at least 180 minutes, double that time, with a camera in your hands, practicing. Don't live your photography vicariously. I mean, what fun, for me at least, what fun is living my photography vicariously through somebody else who's on YouTube? That's not fun. I want to do it. Photography for me, since I'm a people photographer, my business card says I shoot people with a camera. I saw that. Of course,
that was great.
So, photography for me represents access. I find people fascinating. I mean, for much of my life, I photographed beautiful women. So, hey, who wouldn't love that access, right? So, my photographs, I try to create moments. And I think any photograph is a moment, let's be realistic. But even as a portrait, I think that when one of the things that young photographers or new photographers really struggle with is understanding that you can't look at your subject as an object. You have to look at your subject as a human being, and you have to try and put yourself in their shoes. Because if somebody comes to you and says, hey, Frederick, would you shoot a portrait of me? They're not asking you for a picture of what they look like. They're asking you for a picture of themselves on their best day times 10, right? Because that's what we all want, okay? And that means that, you know, they are taking a risk with you. Even if they're fully clothed, they are taking a risk with you to put themselves in a very vulnerable position, because once you pick up that camera, you have a tremendous amount of power. You can make them look great, or you can make them look horrible. So really, people photography in general, but especially portraiture, I always like to explain to people it's 80% psychology. It's actually caring about people. You don't necessarily have to understand all the psychology. You don't necessarily have to understand body language. All that stuff is very helpful, but you have to give a darn, right? If you can't find a way to connect with your subjects, it's hard to make great images. I mean, even in my pictures, one of the things that routinely shows up, and I do it not necessarily consciously, but it's because of my preference, I frequently have my subject staring straight down the barrel of my lens because I love that eye contact, that feeling that, you know, we'll use the glamour world as an example. Two genres of glamour photography. You have the kind of shots where you may have a beautiful woman in a bustier or some piece of lingerie and stockings and high heels, and she's resting her arms on the mantelpiece, you know, by the fireplace. So the picture's taken from a distance, and it's kind of voyeuristic in its feel. There are people that do that tremendously well, and it's very artistic. Or there are the pictures that would almost be comparable to the famous Burt Stern images of Marilyn Monroe called The Last Sitting, where she's just rolling around on a bed. And many of the pictures, you're right here, and you feel like when you look at the pictures that you're actually having that interaction, that you are the one that's interacting with that person, not the photographer. That's definitely where my personal taste goes. So for my shots, I try to do a lot of that. And even with like, I'll be teaching a workshop tomorrow in Newark, Delaware, and I will wind up bullying my attendees to do those really close shots just to try and kind of get them over that ledge to realize, like, you can crop that close, you can get that close, and you're going to get more impact. So it's not that every picture needs to be that way, But I think frequently, photographers are afraid to actually have that kind of connection in a picture. Yep. And so they really, really struggle getting past this. There's an object right there.
Yeah, it's what it sounds like you're talking about is developing a sense of empathy between you and your client. You don't necessarily have to understand everything that they're going through and all that, but you have to be able to sort of elicit and make them feel comfortable at the same time while you're getting the shot that you want, and still having the presence of mind to operate the technical aspects of your gear and the lights and all that stuff. So,
absolutely.
Is that the kind of stuff that you teach in your workshop?
That's really the primary focus of what I do. I'm a big believer that your gear, it has to come as second nature. I mean, when you get in your car, you turn the key or you push the button, but you never say to yourself, how do I drive the car? Mm-hmm. You'll pay attention to the directions, the oncoming traffic, and same with a screwdriver, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. That's as much as we think about. But yet we spend thousands of dollars on cameras and gear and lighting and everything else, and then we get stuck in our gear. We don't learn how to solve the problems. How do we get the camera to do this? How do I move the light so that I get rid of that shadow? I mean, let's face it, all good photography, even landscapes, whatever kind of photography, it's the result of great problem solving. I mean, that's really what, as photographers, we do. We see something, and who wants to take an average picture? Nobody. We want an amazing picture. We want every picture to be epic, which means we've just created a problem for ourselves. How do we achieve that?
Yeah.
So that's really my approach. It's why people have to practice. They really have to learn their gear. Because when you've got a person sitting in front of you, it's different with a landscape. I mean, it's there. The only thing that's changing is the lighting. Mm-hmm. But with a person, if you are head down in your gear and you're not paying attention to that person, you're actually putting a lot of distance between you and your subject. Not physically, but emotionally. So you have a responsibility as a photographer doing portraits. You've got to engage with your subject. You need to have conversations. You need to entertain to a certain degree. I mean, you don't have to be kind of as big and as bold as Peter Hurley, but you've got to find, not many people can do Peter Hurley, right? Nice. But that's also what makes him so good. Yeah. You've got to find kind of your mojo in terms of how are you going to connect with people? How are you going to interact? But that relationship's got to be there. And as a portrait photographer, sometimes you only have, figuratively, 10 or 15 minutes to create that relationship to really make it work.
That's really interesting. You hit on some really interesting topics there, because there is that idea, like we said, empathy and connecting with your subject. But then there's also the aspect of the photographer performing. Right, so you're
sure.
In a lot of ways you're performing for the client, kind of like with infant or child photography. The photographer's back there dancing behind the camera with the bunny and all that stuff. You're still doing that, even with adults, but with different kinds of you're embarrassing yourself in different ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all about keeping that subject engaged, making them feel good. I always joke with photographers, especially portrait photographers, don't be the photographer that takes your test shot. You've got a beautiful subject sitting in front of you. You take your test shot, you look at the LCD, and your response is, oh, crap. Like, don't be that photographer, right? Because now at that point, you've lost your subject for the day, okay? And for somebody that's new and starting out, so here's my simple pro tip for a beginner that's maybe doing their first or second, portrait session and they're really worried about it. Actually invest a few extra minutes. Set up the shot in advance and do your test shots. Even if you can go to Amazon right now. I have it. She's put away right now, but I have a mannequin that I use in a lot of my YouTube videos. You can buy a mannequin for $60.
Nice.
Do your test shots. Figure out your lighting. That way, when your subject comes in, you're maybe a little nervous. They're definitely nervous. They want good pictures. You're able to ease into your shoot, knowing that your first setup, your first couple of shots, you're good to go. You're ready. And don't be afraid to swallow a little bit of pride. Most of us are old enough, not all of us, but most of us are old enough to remember back in grade school, every fall, the school photographer would come out and we'd go to the gym or the cafeteria and we'd have to sit on the box and they would tell us sit up straight and all that stuff. If you ever got to see them set up their gear, most of them were not actually photographers by trade. Mm-hmm. So when they would come in and they would unpack their light stands, there was string attached to the light stands. And they knew one light's going on the left, one light's going on the right, a couple feet from the camera, but then they would hold the string out to get the proper distance. And as long as they had all the lights at the right distance, they knew f5.6 on film were properly exposed. Done.
Yeah.
there's no reason, even if you're going to go shoot your portrait session on location, in maybe it's a corporate thing or it's for a real estate agent, and you're going to do it in their office, you could set up your lighting arrangement in your living room, get it to where you like it, a couple little pieces of string, and then you can walk in anywhere and like a pro, set up, boom, you're ready to shoot. And the great part of it is you're going into that session with a confidence of knowing this lighting setup works. I'm going to have the ratios that I want. I'm going to have the shadows where I want them. And you can start shooting. Certainly, once you've got your shots, experiment. Try something a little bit different. Step outside of your box. But it's important to be able to kind of get that momentum going and keep everybody's confidence at play.
I love that. I love that. All right, let's wrap this up. So you've got a ton of information. I love that. And
thank you.
And I have a feeling, a sneaking suspicion that some of this is on your YouTube channel, right?
Yeah, there's a fair amount of it on the YouTube channel. Yes, there is.
I saw it. So where should people go to A, sign up for your workshop, check out the YouTube channel, other resources that you're pumping out there for photographers?
Cool. So I'll admit I'm one of those crazy people. I'm everywhere on social media, but the two best places to find me, my website, which is simply joeedelman.com. And then on YouTube, it's youtube.com/photo, PHOTO, Photo Joe Edelman. I do a weekly live stream every Wednesday. It's called Todd Chat. And I generally get a new video tutorial out about once every week and a half. And again, it ranges anything from how to take a piece of gear and maybe hack it, turn into something else. I do a lot of DIY stuff, a lot with lighting, posing, all that kind of stuff.
I love it. I love it. And,
thank you.
And I know I said this off air, but I want to say it officially on air. Thank you for all that you do. But also I want to invite you to come on This Week in Photo as a guest from time to time as your schedule permits. I'd love that.
I would love to, sir. You call, I'll be there.
Awesome. All right, Joe Edelman, thank you, sir.
Frederick, thanks for having me. Take care.
You're welcome. This is TWIP.